Hello, folks, and welcome to the initial podcast of the Occidental Jihadist. Timothy Furnish, but that's my handle on Twitter, and that's also my website, the Occidental Jihadist. Some of you know me. I do a lot of work on Islam, mainly the Middle East, also Middle Earth. Four of my books have been on Middle East. One was on Middle Earth. I'm working on another one on the military history thereof. God willing, I'll get it done before too long. But I've been working in Islam for, this whole millennium. Did a PhD at Ohio State in Islamic world and African history. Before that, I was an Arabic linguist in the U.S. Army. Later, I worked as a civilian analyst for U.S. Army Intelligence, Special Operations Command. So, been around the block a little bit, been writing for a long time. And although I recently saw a meme online that said it's okay to talk to people without starting a podcast, nonetheless, here I am on a fool's errand of starting a podcast. And I do wish to point out, however, that I'm not doing this from the front of my car. I'm doing this from an undisclosed location in Dar al-Harb, which is what Muslims refer to as the non-Muslim world. Actually, I live in Georgia, so which is part of the Dar al-Harb, I guess. At least so far. All right, so this is my first podcast, and I wanted to cover basically something in general about Islam. I hope to do more specific stuff in the future, depending on if anyone pays any attention, God willing. But basically what I want to talk about today is sort of an updated version of an article I wrote a few years ago for the Stream. I write pretty regularly for an online conservative Christian outlet called The Stream. And about 4 years ago, I wrote an article called A Guide for the Misled on Islam, which was a takeoff on a book I remember reading in undergraduate philosophy class back during the Carter administration by a guy named E.F. Schumacher called A Guide for the Perplexed. So basically, I'm going to kind of do an update of this Guide for the Perplexed about Islam, because there's a lot of information about Islam in the public square, particularly since 9/11. And frankly, some of it is just garbage. There's a lot of propaganda. There's a lot of ignorance. A lot of well-meaning people write and talk about Islam in the public square that really, frankly, don't know what they're talking about. So I'm going to try to see if I can help with that. So, basically, the first thing I want to talk about is what I deem to be the four essential truths about Islam that everyone needs to know. Number one is Islam is a religion. Now, this puts me at loggerheads sometimes with a lot of my conservative brethren and sistren, if you will. And I've had people tell me, and I've in person, in places where I've spoken, and also I've seen plenty of claims online to this effect that Islam is not a religion. It's a totalitarian political ideology masquerading as a religion. That's not true. Islam is a religion. It has a holy book. It has a self-proclaimed prophet. It has an eschatology, a belief about the end of the world, which, by the way, is my major academic specialization, and I'll talk more about that later. It has angels, demons, things in between called jinn. It has all the sociological aspects that comprise a religion. So to say Islam is not a religion is just silly, to be charitable. Now, my number 2 point is that Islam is political. And yes, I do agree that it's the most political religion on earth, as long as you don't consider Marxism or wokeism, which are sort of two sides of the same coin, aren't they, to be a religion, which is debatable. But Islam is the most political religion on earth. No doubt about that. It has been since its early days. Muhammad was not just, according to the Muslims, in his own mind, a religious leader, someone that the supreme deity, again, their belief, not mine, was talking to, and someone that created basically a new religion, which is really, frankly, a bastardization of Christianity. But he also led armies in battle, ordered people beheaded, and also became a political leader, basically the ruler of Arabia for his death. So the founding documents and the founding paradigms of Islam, which is now the world's second largest religion, are political. It's practically impossible, I would argue, to divorce Islam from politics. In fact, the way Islam is structured is such that it's really Islam doesn't really work, at least in the view of most Muslims, unless it is the reigning political system as well. So, yes, Islam is political, very political, the most political religion on earth, but that does not thereby make it not a religion. It's just the most political religion on earth. So that's number one and number two. Number three, which is pretty obvious to those with, eyes to see and ears to hear, is that Islam is violent. Now, are all Muslims violent? No. There are anywhere between 1.5 and 1.8 billion Muslims on the face of the earth, world's second largest religion. Christianity is still the largest with over 2 billion, by most accounts about 2.3 billion. But Islam has a lot of people. And even if we assume that 1 to 10%, somewhere in the region of 1 to 10%, let's be charitable. Let's say only 1% of Muslims are violent. That's still 18 million. I happen to think it's larger than that. Why? The main reason is that the Islamic texts, the holy books of Islam, as well as the example of the founder of Islam, both lionize violence. The Quran has, by one count, 164 jihad verses. And jihad, by the way, does not mean just being a good Muslim. It means using violence against non-Muslims. So I'll get to that in a moment. Islam, the founding texts of Islam, the example of Muhammad himself, show that violence is not just an option, but is often the preferred way to deal with something. So, particularly opposition to Allah and his messenger, Muhammad, as they see it. So, most of the world's Muslims have better things to do than engage in violence. But anyone with predilection for violence, that wants to engage in violence, can find ample textual support and historical support in Islam. This is why, for instance, look at the terrorism stats. A while back, I blogged on the latest example of the U.S. State Department Foreign Terrorist Organization list. And there are, in the most recent update of the FTO list, there are 78 groups altogether. 54 of them are Muslim. I'm looking at my notes. 54 of them are Muslim, so 69% are Muslim. 47 of which are Sunni, 6 of which are Shia, Shi'i, I should say, and 1 is Sufi, which is an Islamic mystical group. The next closest ideology motivating terrorism, according to the U.S. State Department, and again, this list has been pretty much the same across administrations. It's just not something we can blame on Trump. The next most prevalent ideology, or influential ideology, is drug cartelism, if you will. And that's because the Trump administration in 2025 here added 8 Latin American drug cartels to the terrorist list. So that second, although that's not exactly a coherent ideology. Third is Marxism. And there's a number of Marxist groups, but not nearly as many as there are Muslims. So it's really hard to argue that Islam has nothing to do with violence when most of the world's terrorist groups are Muslim. And again, this doesn't mean all Muslims are violent. It just simply means that those that wish to resort to violence find ample support in Islam if they wish to do so. Thank God most of the world's Muslims have better things to do than to scour their scriptures for excuses to chop people's heads off or blow up buildings or go after infidels, non-Muslims. But clearly, if people want to, they can find the examples to back up examples in scriptural texts to back up wanting to do that. So now, that was my third essential truth about Islam. My fourth one is something that may seem counterintuitive based on what in comparison to what I just said. But my fourth one is that moderate Islam does exist. And again, this is much like the contention that Islam is a religion. Thank you for my German Shepherd for giving me moral support here. She's heard all this before, so she's clearly bored. Moderate Islam does exist, which again might seem a bit counterintuitive based on the fact that I just said Islam has all this intrinsic violence in its holy texts and in the examples of Muhammad and frankly Islamic leaders throughout history. But it does exist. And I define moderate Islam, and again, this sometimes puts me at loggerheads with people on my own side of the political, even religious spectrum, who say there's no such thing as moderate Islam. I think moderate Islam is defined by non-literalism toward the Quran and toward the Hadiths. The Quran, of course, in Islam, the literal word of Allah. The Hadiths are collected sayings about utterances, collected documents supposedly about Muhammad's sayings and actually some of the actions Muhammad did. So they are not considered to be as holy writ like the Quran, but they are just barely below the Quran in terms of authority for most Muslims. So Muslim groups, of which there are some, mainly the sects, S-E-C-T-S, that don't take the Quran literally and may not take all of the hadiths literally or at face value. Those are where I think you can argue there's a moderate Islam. And a few years ago, I wrote an article on this. I actually had done some research and a paper on this 12, 13 years ago when I worked at Special Operations Command. And I came up with a figure of somewhere between about 8 to 10% of the world's Muslims could be defined as moderate by this viewpoint. Sects like some of the Sufi orders, the Islamic mystical orders, some of the smaller Shia sects. There are 3 major sects of Islam, of Shia. Particularly, there's one called the Ismailis, who are in many ways sort of modernized and define jihad as not violence against non-Muslims, but define jihad as things like social welfare and immunization programs and building desalinization plants, things like that. Groups like the Ahmadis. So these groups are, by mainstream, particularly Sunnis, are often considered to be heretics. But the fact is that there is a strain within these sects in Islam that allow for allegorical, symbolic, other non-literal ways, to some extent, of interpreting the Quran and the Hadith. So I think, we should hope and pray that that sort of approach toward Islam grows. Maybe it will. We don't know. But I guess that would be playing the long game. So those are my 4 essential truths about Islam. Islam is a religion. Number 2, Islam is violent. Notice I don't say Muslims are violent. Muslims can be violent. Islam itself is violent. Just frankly is. Go read it. Go read the Quran. There's a big difference between the Gospels where Jesus says, turn the other cheek and love your neighbor as yourself, and Muhammad saying, Allah saying, but it's Muhammad saying things like, lie in wait for, besiege, attack those who impede the messenger of Allah. So it's quite different. Number 3, Islam is far too often violent. And number 4, nonetheless, in the sects, in smaller minorities of Islam, moderates do exist that I define as non-literalists. So, all right, so those are my 4 essential truths. And then there are 7 key terms I think most people need to know about if they want to understand anything about Islam. And again, for a lot of people, this is obvious, but for a lot of people, you get information about these sorts of things, these topics in Islam, that just frankly aren't accurate because of tendentiousness or ignorance or both. So the first was Allah, all right? Allah is the God in Arabic. he is the supreme deity in Islam. Now they can argue he's the only deity, but go look into a topic called the Satanic Verses, which of course was the famous Salman Rushdie book from the 80s that got him the death penalty from the Iranians and some other groups. The Satanic Verses refers to actually some passages in the Quran where Muhammad had showed up preaching to worship this one deity called Allah, and didn't seem to be making much headway. And eventually, Allah sends, according to Muhammad, sends him another revelation that there are some other deities of the Arab pagan polytheistic pantheon besides Allah that are okay to worship, 4 or 5 others. And then this, of course, caused a bit of consternation because people were like, well, wait a minute, you've been talking about worshiping one deity. Now you're saying we can worship 4 or 5. What is up with you? And then, miraculously, Muhammad received another revelation that, that last one where I told you that and you didn't like it, that it was okay to be quasi-polytheistic, that was actually insinuated into my head by Iblis, by Satan. So it wasn't from Allah. So it's a whole can of worms for Muslims. And to me, that alone would show how Islam is not true, because if Satan can sneak in and fool the prophet, you got a problem, right? Plus, it calls into question the whole veracity of the Quran, which is apologetics we'll get into another day. But anyway, Allah. I got off track a little bit, but Allah in Islam is the one God, and it means literally the God in Arabic. And reason I want to bring that up is because there's sort of this common belief, particularly among many Christians, that Allah is the same God that Jews and Christians worship in the Old and New Testaments, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, and that that's sort of a point of agreement between the major religions, particularly Christianity and Islam. But again, I think this is bunk. The Quran basically has, according to the Quran, Allah tells Muhammad that the most essential truths about Christianity are not true, particularly dealing with Jesus. Yes, there's a lot about Jesus in the Quran, and pretty much the only thing they agree on, Islam and Christianity, is he was born of a virgin. Beyond that, it's he wasn't the Son of God. He's not divine in any sense. He did do miracles. Okay, so 2 things. He's born of a virgin, and he did miracles, but he wasn't crucified. He thus was not resurrected, so there's no atonement. And plus, the Quran also says that there's no such, that the Trinity is not true, or else grossly misrepresents the Trinity. And in fact, declares anathema people, Christians that is, who believe in the Trinity or the divinity of Jesus. So if you're going to say Allah is the same deity that Jews and particularly Christians worship, then you've got this whole issue where in the New Testament, in the Bible, God says one thing and Jesus says one thing about himself, but then in the Quran he says something else. Now, of course, Muslims have come up with this theory in order to justify their religion, that Christians corrupted the Bible or rewrote it, or, I don't know. This is talking about conspiracy theories. This would be the biggest conspiracy in history, that somehow all of these Bibles that have been written, 600 years before Muhammad comes along, they were somehow all corrupted, and there was this vast conspiracy to make them say something that wasn't true. So just again, collapses of its own weight. So Allah is the supreme deity in Islam, but A, he wasn't always the supreme deity. Go look at the Satanic Verses. And B, he's not the same God that Christians and Jews worship, particularly Christians. No, he's not. Caliph or caliphate, caliph or caliphate, all right? Important term. I bring it up because a lot of people think that it's an idea that only so-called radicals or extremists in Islam support. It's not. It's a very mainstream belief, particularly among Sunnis, who make up 75-80% of the world's Muslims. Caliph is from Khalifa, which means to succeed, not succeed, to succeed. So Khalifa is the person that succeeded Muhammad after he passed, 632 AD, as who was chosen to replace Muhammad as military leader and political leader. Of course, not as prophet. And we'll talk about that with the Shia, but for the mainstream group that became Sunni, prophecy stops with Muhammad, but military and political leadership doesn't, because again, Muhammad basically had those three roles. So the top leadership of the Muslim community at the time, the burgeoning Muslim empire, chose someone to be the caliph, and then after he passed, they chose someone else, and so on and so forth. It wasn't even remotely democratic. Muslims will try to tell you that. No, it wasn't. It was the top 12 or 15 or 20 military and political leaders choosing the next guy to be in charge. So the first four caliphs were supposedly agreed upon, and then they had a split with Ali, and I'll talk more about that later. Turned into a civil war, and then basically the whole Muslim world fractured. You had multiple caliphs, and eventually the caliphate dies out, caliphate being the office of the caliph. To make a long story short, it was basically resurrected by the Ottomans when they came along in the 16th century, and they took over, and they claimed that the Ottoman leader had found the sword of the caliph in Cairo when the Ottomans conquered Egypt, and then that conferred on him the authority to be the caliph, although it went back and forth for a while before they openly claimed the caliphate. So the last sort of generally agreed upon caliphate collapsed, went away with the Ottoman, when the Ottoman Empire transmogrified, if you will, into the Turkish Republic. The Turks did away with the caliphate, and there hasn't been a caliph since. And so there's a lot of data, though. Look at organizations like the Pew organization that does every so often does surveys of opinion and ideas in the Muslim world. There's a lot of support for recreating a caliphate. For instance, there's a group dedicated to this called Hizb ut-Tahrir, Party of Liberation. I've been to two of their meetings. They meet regularly in Chicago. They usually did a few years ago. Hizb ut-Tahrir is generally considered a terrorist group in most Muslim countries because they don't like it. The United States doesn't consider it a terrorist group. It's interesting. But Hizb ut-Tahrir, their reason for existence is to try to bring back the caliphate. And this is something that unites Muslims from moderates to jihadists. One of the things that bin Laden wanted to do was bring back the caliphate. So basically, it's just an idea that Muslims should have their own ruler, and Islamic countries should be under sort of the umbrella rule of a caliphate. Now, not all Muslims agree with this, but a lot do. So it's not just an extremist viewpoint. Is my point. The third term that's important to know is Islamist. The reason you didn't know it is so you don't use it. It's it's a useless term. Islamist is often used, and I wrote an article about this on the stream a couple years ago. And those of you that follow me on social media know that this is one of my major irritants. It's a burr under my saddle, and I often people will use it. Conservatives, liberals, Christians, Muslims, secularists use this term all the time, and they should avoid it. Particularly my conservative friends should avoid it. Why? Because it lets Islam off the hook. The term Islamist basically was created in order to say, well, there's this that Islam is really sort of not really fanatical, or Islam isn't in any sense fundamentalist or extremist. And the real extremists in Islam are these people that have broken away from the moorings of Islam, and they perverted the religion, they've corrupted it, and then we call them Islamists. But the problem is that's not true. People that want Muslims that want politics and want Sharia law and want their country to be ruled by more Islamic norms are not Islamists. They're Muslims. Fighting jihad is not something that some fringe group called the Islamists came up with. It is intrinsic to Islam. Jihad is an intrinsic idea in Islam. It's not something that was like created by another group who's, uber political as opposed to regular Muslims. So I don't like the term at all, because basically what it does is it says, well, Islam and Muslims really aren't responsible for jihad and the really onerous aspects of Sharia and things like that. It's these mythical Islamists. Stop using it, please. Friends don't yet let friends use the term Islamist or Islamism. Just don't use it. All it does is give Islam excuses and be able to give it plausible deniability, if you will, for these people that are really just basically fundamentalist Muslims, of which there are many. Quickly, on that point, no, I'll deal with that when I get to Sunni. That's coming up in a minute. Jihad. I've touched on jihad a number of times. Jihad does not mean brushing your teeth like the Prophet or practicing ablutions and praying like the Prophet Muhammad. Again, he's not a prophet to me. I always have to tell my students in college that you don't have to, undergrad and graduate, I also teach graduate classes. You don't have to refer to Muhammad as the Prophet with a capital P because, are you Muslim? No, then don't, I wouldn't expect a Muslim student to refer to Jesus as Jesus Christ with a capital C, or the Son of God, or the second person of the Trinity. So I'm sure as heck not going to refer to Muhammad, a man whom I don't follow, as the prophet, because you know what? He's not a prophet to me. So just to say the founder of Islam, if you will, if you want to be polite. Jihad means every instance in which jihad shows up in the hadiths, or look at any major Arabic dictionary dealing with the term, and it tells you jihad means holy war. It doesn't mean being a good Muslim. It doesn't mean struggle. Yes, the root word whence it derives, jahada, means to struggle. But every instance of jihad over the past 1,000 years at least means holy war. It means using violence against non-Muslims in order to bring them to heel, to conquer them, and if they are recalcitrant enough, to kill them and to conquer their territory. So that's what it means. So Sharia, touched on that too. Islamic law. Now, there are different variations of Sharia. There's 4 major different schools of Sharia within the Sunni world: Maliki, Hanafi, Hanbali, and Shafi'i. And then the major group of the Shia, the 12er Shia, also have their own interpretive school, what's called School of Jurisprudence, fiqh, called Jafari. So there are slight variations within these different schools of Islamic law, these different which determine Sharia, but they aren't that different. They basically share the same commonalities. All the beliefs I've just been talking about. Allah, Muhammad is La ilaha illa Allah wa Muhammad Rasulullah. And I'm not going to say that twice more because then I'll be a Muslim. There is no deity but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. And Sharia is in large measure distilled from the Quran, although I know I'm simplifying something that's very complicated. So there are commonalities because you can only get so far away from the Quran when if you go too far away from the Quran, then you are no longer Muslim. So there are commonalities, and much of Sharia law is brutal. There are almost all of the schools of Sharia law agree, for instance, that the penalty for apostasy from Islam, that is converting to another religion, from Islam to another religion, is death. I think 3 of the 4 Sunni laws, I have to go back and look, 3 of the 4 Sunni schools of law say that the penalty for homosexuality is death. Yes, by the way, there are 7 countries of the world that currently have the death penalty for homosexuality, and none of them is named Texas. They're all Islamic countries. Go look the list up. Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Iran, and there are 4 more. Sudan, there are 3 more. None of them are the United States or Texas or, Georgia or something like that. Alcohol is forbidden. There are commonalities of these of Sharia law. Stoning, many of them prescribe stoning for adultery. So and not the kind that, involves vaping a certain material. It's hitting people with rocks till they're dead. So there are commonalities of this, and Sharia law is rightly to be rejected in the West because it's antithetical to pretty much every belief system in the West, Christian or secular. And finally, the last two terms here, Sunni and Shia. Just so you know, I've touched again on these both, but Sunni is the majority branch of Islam. And by the way, people will often say, well, there are two branches of Islam, Sunni and Shia. Well, that's a vast oversimplification. That's like saying there are three branches of Christianity, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant. Well, yeah, but within those, there are variations. Within the Orthodox, there are different national churches, and even the Catholic Church has its branches that have split off. And, Lord knows the Protestants have thousands of denominations. And the same is true in Islam. It's just that people don't look closely at it enough to realize that. And I was getting at this earlier when I was talking about sects of Islam. There are lots of sects, even in the Sunni world. So the Sunnis, however, the major difference between Sunnis as a block, BLOC, and the Shia as a block, Sunnis make up 75 to 80% of the world's Muslims. Again, there are many different denominations, if you will, within Sunnism. But in general, the difference between them and the Shia, it's a historical split. It goes back to a fight over who would be the fourth caliph. Ali was chosen as the fourth caliph because Ali was Muhammad, the closest male relative that Muhammad, the founder of Islam, had. He was Muhammad's cousin, and he had also married one of Muhammad's daughters. And he made the cut as the fourth caliph. But he spent 5 years as caliph, and then there was an assassination. He was assassinated. And but this basically was a split between Sunni and Shia. It was a political split that became religious because Ali had two sons, Hassan and Hussein, who were Muhammad's grandsons because, again, Ali had married one of Muhammad's, had married Fatima, one of Muhammad's daughters. And so after Ali was killed, some of the top leadership and some of the people in the Muslim community at the time said, well, as in 661 AD, said that, well, one of Muhammad's grandsons, Ali's son, should be the next caliph because they, for reasons that are really sort of lost to history, they had developed this idea that it should be a sort of a bloodline dynasty, if you will. And they lost. The majority said, no, that's not how we're going to pick the caliph. And they picked somebody else based on other criteria, had nothing to do with descent from Muhammad. So that became the genesis of the Sunni Shia split. And again, sometimes it's analogized to the differences between Protestants and Catholics and the development of the Protestant Reformation, starting with Luther. But it's the converse. When Luther did what he did, it had nothing to do with who was going to be in charge politically. It was a theological spat. Eventually it became political because of the situation in Europe in 1517. But it was primarily a theological difference that eventually became also political. This is the converse. I always forget, converse or opposite. This is a political fight over who's going to be in charge that eventually, as time goes by, also develops religious aspects. So Shia, basically, to this day, the largest branch being the Twelver Shia in Iran and Iraq and Azerbaijan and Lebanon, particularly Iran and Iraq, believe that there were 12 imams after Muhammad, starting with Ali. The last one disappeared in the 9th century AD, and that each one of them should have been recognized as the leader of the entire Islamic community and wasn't, and because the Sunni were too obtuse or whatever. And anyway, they basically believe the 12th Imam disappeared, did not die, and he will return at the end of time or before the end of time as the Mahdi, the Islamic political and military leader who will take over the world for Islam. And they believe that there were 12 of these and the 12th one. So there are also other branches of Shiism, but that's the largest. So, all right, so that's 7 key terms and 4 essential truths. And I got a little lecture-y, but hey, I teach college, so what do you want from me? At least I'm not doing this in my car. It's a cooler background, you got to admit, especially with the bored dog over here. So, All right. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Let me know what you think in the comments, or you can reach me at my website, theoccidentaljihadist.com, or I'm on Twitter, Occidental Jihad. Thanks a lot.